September 13th, 1814. Night fell over Baltimore Harbor, but darkness did not last long. Moments later, the sky exploded with fire. British warships surrounded a small American fortress and began launching rockets into the night. Cannon fire thundered across the water. Explosions lit the clouds in flashes of red and orange. For the next 25 hours, the bombardment would not stop. And somewhere in the harbor, a man stood on the deck of a ship, watching the battle unfold. He didn't know it yet, but before morning came, he would write words that would become the national anthem of the United States. His name was Francis Scott Key, and this is the story of the night the Star-Spangled Banner was born. In 1814, the United States was still a very young nation. Just a few decades earlier, the country had won independence from Britain during the American Revolutionary War. But tensions with Britain never truly disappeared. By 1812, conflict erupted again. The war that followed, now called the War of 1812, was brutal and uncertain. Both nations fought fiercely on land and sea. But in the summer of 1814, the war took a terrifying turn. British forces invaded Washington, D.C. They burned government buildings, they burned the Capitol, and they burned the White House. The young nation watched in shock as its capital went up in flames. Now the British fleet turned toward another target. Baltimore. Baltimore was one of America's busiest ports. If the British captured the city, they could cripple American trade and morale. Standing between the British Navy and Baltimore Harbor was a single defensive position, a star-shaped fortress called Fort McHenry. The fort's thick walls were guarded by around 1,000 American soldiers. Their commander knew the attack was coming. Cannons were loaded, defenses were prepared, and above the fort flew an enormous American flag. It measured nearly 30 feet high and 42 feet wide. The defenders wanted the British to see it clearly. It was a message. The fort was ready, and it would not surrender easily. At the same time, a man named Francis Scott Key arrived in Baltimore Harbor. Key was not a soldier. He was a lawyer. He had come to negotiate the release of an American prisoner captured by the British. The negotiations succeeded. But there was a problem. During the discussions, Key had overheard details about the coming attack on Baltimore. The British could not allow him to return to the city with that information. So they kept him on a ship in the harbor, right in front of the battlefield. He was forced to watch, helpless, waiting to see whether Baltimore would survive the night. On the evening of September 13th, the bombardment began. British ships opened fire on Fort McHenry. Cannons roared across the water. Massive Congreve rockets screamed through the air. The rockets left trails of fire as they streaked across the night sky. Explosions shook the harbor. Inside the fort, American soldiers fired back with their own cannons. But the British fleet had positioned their ships just beyond the range of the American guns. This meant the defenders could do little but endure the attack, hour after hour. Bombs rained down, smoke swallowed the sky, rain began to fall. The night seemed endless. From the deck of his ship, Francis Scott Key watched every explosion. Each blast made him ask the same question. Was the fort still standing, or had it already fallen? Above the walls of Fort McHenry flew the enormous American flag. During the bombardment, thick smoke covered the battlefield. Most of the time, nothing could be seen. But occasionally, the sky would flash with light from an explosion, and in those brief flashes, Key could see the flag. Still there, still flying. Then darkness would return, and the waiting would begin again. Finally, after more than 25 hours of bombardment, the cannons fell silent. Morning slowly arrived over Baltimore Harbor. Smoke drifted across the water. Francis Scott Key stared toward the fort, searching through the mist. For a moment, he saw nothing. Then suddenly, the smoke cleared, and there it was. Not the smaller storm flag used during bad weather, but the massive garrison flag, still waving proudly above Fort McHenry. The fort had survived. Baltimore had been saved. Overwhelmed by what he had witnessed, Key began writing a poem on the back of a letter he carried. The words described the battle he had just seen, the rockets' red glare, the bombs bursting in air. The poem was first titled Defense of Fort McHenry. Soon it spread across newspapers. Later it was set to music, and over time the song became known as the Star-Spangled Banner. In 1931, more than a century after that battle, the United States officially adopted it as the national anthem. Today, the anthem is sung across the country, at stadiums, at ceremonies, and at moments of national pride. But every note traces back to one night in 1814, a burning sky, a flag in the smoke, and the moment a nation found its voice.